Well, it's another edition, not of PFT Live, but PFT PM. You know how it goes in these parts. The week after the Super Bowl, PFT Live is off. In theory, it's a slow news week. In reality, there's never a slow news week in the NFL. That's why we give you PFT PM primarily when PFT Live takes a break. 1 week in February and 4 to 6 to 7 or 8 weeks, depending upon the Olympic schedule, in June and July. So we'll be here all week. I might tap on the shoulder Miles Simmons or Shireen Williams to join me for one of the next 4 days. Whether or not they agree to join me is a different issue altogether. Either way, the goal is 5 for 5. We'll at least be 1 for 1 because this is Monday, it's President's Day, but there are some things to discuss, and let's get right to it. Just as the NFL was reaching a low water mark from a news flow cycle over the weekend, came word from the Baltimore Banner, which had the original report of multiple accusations of inappropriate behavior by Ravens kicker Justin Tucker during massage therapy sessions. Again, he has denied everything. He had a lengthy post on Twitter late January when the first allegations initially arose, denying it all, and will honor and respect his position. He's entitled to his position. But now, given the latest report from the Baltimore Banner, the number of total accusers is 16. I don't know where the line is between sufficiently few that it can be brushed off by the player and his representatives as people lying, embellishing, fabricating, trying to get paid, all of the things that we often hear when someone is accused of misconduct in a setting where there are no witnesses. At some point between 2 and 16, it's hard to believe, just as a matter of basic common sense, setting aside the allegations and the denial, just as a matter of basic common sense, the sheer volume of accusations makes it hard to believe that they're all lying, that they've all teamed up, that they're all being manipulated by lawyers who are looking to make a big score. It's hard to hold that many together. With that many different people, that many different levels of conscience, it's hard to imagine all of them holding together unless they each individually believe that something happened that was objectionable. That was the case with Deshaun Watson. Once it reached a critical mass and ultimately in the 20s of accusers. And now here we are, approaching 20 with Justin Tucker. So no matter how this would ever play out in a court of law, and who knows if any lawsuits will ever be filed, no matter how this plays out in the NFL's in-house judicial system, where allegations like this are investigated, and if proven, discipline is meted out. Regardless of any of that, we're at 16. Court of public opinion takes over. And my thought was once we got to double digits, because that's where we last were, there were 9, and then there was a 10th who hadn't spoken to the Baltimore Banner, but who had retained counsel. Once we were in that range, I thought it's going to be hard for the Ravens to continue this relationship. Kickers are interchangeable. And when Justin Tucker has undergone some of the struggles we've seen on the field, particularly last year, it becomes easier to justify the basic reality of an NFL team. All the players are interchangeable parts in a football machine, and at some point they will be swapped out for a new part. And I can't help but believe that the Ravens have reached the point, especially now, where they'll be swapping out the kicker part and putting in a new kicker. They'll save money. Tucker's due to make over $4 million this year, and they'll avoid the PR headache that goes along with these allegations. The Ravens have been silent, but for the initial statement that was issued when the charges first arose. Not charges, allegations. I want to be fair to everyone here. But we have to be fair to our own common sense. At 16, it's kind of hard to look at it and say it's all a hoax. It's a witch hunt. 16's a lot. And from a football standpoint, it'd be different if Justin Tucker played a critical role in the ongoing success of the Ravens. It'd be different if his skills were at a level where they would be hard to duplicate with someone who doesn't bring the baggage that comes from the 16 allegations. Basic football decisions get made all the time, and sometimes factors other than football are relevant to the decision. Before the latest report from the Baltimore Banner, I figured we'd get to the middle of March, start of the new league year. Tucker gets released with a post-June 1 designation to split the cap charge from 1 year into 2. I wonder at this point, can the Ravens get through the next 3 weeks or so for the new league year to begin? Or will they need to act before that? Or will they just announce that they are going to release Justin Tucker at the start of the league year? That would suffice. That's what the Jets did with Aaron Rodgers. They said last week they're moving on. They'll officially move on when the new league year begins. Nothing prevents the Ravens from doing that. So the silence from the Ravens is getting louder and louder. Some might say it's already deafening. We'll monitor it. It could be this week that the Ravens make their announcement. They'll need a plan at kicker in lieu of Justin Tucker. But again, there are kickers everywhere. Good kickers aren't everywhere, but Tucker isn't and hasn't been performing at the level that justified the contract he now has. That's one of the other factors. Setting aside the allegations, is he a $4.2 million kicker? With the allegations, is it worth the headache for the Ravens? It may sound unfair, especially if you're Justin Tucker and you staunchly deny these allegations, but how did we get here? How did we get to the point where there are 16 people who are making these accusations, especially if they're false? How does that happen? It all comes back to common sense. And for football, it all comes back to business. They don't want us to know it's a business. It is a business. And there are many considerations that shape the decisions made by a business. And one, when you're dealing with a business that relies upon people to buy tickets and show up and support the team, there is a point where the noise forces action. Right or wrong, fair or unfair, the noise at this point seems to be pointing to the Ravens taking decisive action. I'm not sure what else they would do other than move on and avoid a headache and a distraction coming from a position that typically doesn't present teams with headaches and distractions. Free agency is coming. There aren't a ton of big names on the market, and there's definitely not the cluster of high-end running backs who will be trying to prove that running backs are still worth a lot of money. We had the Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs experience last year. There aren't running backs like that due to become free agents this year. All due respect, those guys are special. And I think we've adjusted our mindset about running backs. The basic approach is they're almost as interchangeable as kickers. Every major college program has one guy, at least, some have more than one, who, if given the opportunity at the NFL level, if you block for him, if you can trust him to pick up blitzers in pass situations, and if he can hold on to the football when it's being attacked in a very aggressive way with punches and high-end defensive players, the likes of which he's never seen in his life on a football field, those guys can thrive, but they can't excel. That's the difference. There's a small group that excels. Now, this year's crop of free agents at running back, well, it's a little bit thinner because the Panthers might have learned the lessons of the Giants and the Titans and the Raiders in moving on from their high-end running backs. The Panthers re-signed Chuba Hubbard during the season. The Cardinals re-signed James Conner during the season. They both would have been free agents. The most accomplished running back hitting the market is Najee Harris. 4 years in the NFL, 1,000 yards rushing each year. No fifth-year option was exercised by the Pittsburgh Steelers. If the Steelers are going to give him a long-term deal, it's the Doug Martin situation all over again. Remember him, the muscle hamster? That was the nickname that finally stuck. I don't think he really liked that nickname. Regardless, he liked the contract he got from the Buccaneers the year he became a free agent when they hadn't used the fifth-year option. There hasn't been any real indication that the Steelers are inclined to keep Najee Harris. I don't think it would get this close to the open market if they were going to. I doubt they're going to use the franchise tag on Najee Harris. It's creeping up to around $13 million a year based upon the estimated increase in the salary cap for 2025. And I saw something over the weekend from, I think, one of the Twitter bot sites pointing out that Alvin Kamara, the Saints running back, has never had a 1,000-yard rushing season, and Najee Harris has had 4. with whatever emoji properly reflects that sentiment. The mind blown emoji, I don't know. The double eyeballs emoji. But the story runs far deeper than that. Alvin Kamara has been one of the best running backs in the NFL for the last 8 years. And for him, he's much more of a dual threat than Najee Harris. I did some math, which is always dangerous for me, before starting this today. Najee Harris averages in 4 NFL seasons 1,365 yards from scrimmage. Rushing, receiving. Because a running back's total production should matter. We went through this with Chris Johnson at the Super Bowl 2 weeks ago. The thing he's most proud of his entire NFL career is the year 2009 where he had 2,500 yards from scrimmage, because no one in NFL history has ever had 2,500 yards from scrimmage. Does it matter whether it's a pitch or a screen pass? I don't think it matters. What the guy does with the football matters. So, Najee Harris, 1,365 yards from scrimmage on average. Alvin Kamara, 1,442. Alvin Kamara, 10.6 touchdowns per year on average. Najee Harris, 8.6. And yards per touch is relevant to this as well. Kamara, 4.4 yards per carry. Harris, 3.9. Kamara, 8.3 yards per catch. Harris, 6.4. Now, I'm not taking anything away from Harris, but this question of interchangeable running backs, the dividing line is good versus great. Kamara has been great. Kamara got his 1,442 yards from scrimmage per year on average by not being a workhorse. They've used other running backs. If they would have used him in New Orleans the way the Panthers were using Christian McCaffrey early in his career, because remember, they arrived the same season. And once McCaffrey became a star, folks from the Saints would point out, let's look at per touch, because McCaffrey gets a lot more than Kamara. And Kamara does a lot with the opportunities he gets. So Kamara is in the category of great. Najee Harris is in the category of good. And the Steelers seem to be inclined, despite the lessons learned last year by most notably the Giants, the Steelers seem to be inclined to let Najee Harris walk away. Now, look, Najee Harris brings a fire, an energy, a determination. He gets the tough yards. He runs between the tackles. He is a very good running back. But this is the closest thing we're going to see in 2025 of a repeat of last year. And I don't think Harris will be as likely to make the Steelers regret their decision as Barkley, Henry, and Jacobs may have made their former teams regret theirs. It's one of the big storylines for free agency because the class really isn't all that top heavy. There are some big names, T. Higgins, Sam Darnold, etc. A lot of the action is going to come from trades this year. But as free agent running backs go, Najee Harris is the best. Is he in that class of the very finest that we saw last year? He will surely think he is, because confidence is the number one prerequisite for being successful at the NFL level. You got to have the God-given physical abilities, but you got to be confident. You got to believe that you're going to be great. And maybe the Steelers letting him go will cause him to unlock a higher level of performance. But as it stands right now, he's closer to the pack than Barkley, Henry, and Jacobs. That leads me to another big name running back, the guy who was supplanted last year in Green Bay when Josh Jacobs arrived, Aaron Jones. He lands at Minnesota. One of the developments over the weekend, there was a void in his contract set for today. It's been delayed until March 11 to give the Vikings and Jones time to work out a new deal. The Vikings want to keep him around. And the Vikings offense was very different last year when Jones was on the field versus when he wasn't. Whatever the Vikings do with Jones, though, they need to find themselves a bruising between the tackles runner, kind of like the Rams have with Kyron Williams, somebody who can get some yards and keep the defense on its heels a little bit so that the pass game is even easier to operate. But the Vikings are one of those teams that is pass first. They don't run to set up the pass. They pass to set up the run, or they pass to set up the pass. The running game isn't a big staple of Vikings offense, not as big as it may be for other teams. They may want to consider, especially if they're going to go with J.J. McCarthy, having a guy who can take some heat off the quarterback a little bit, maybe draw a safety up to the line of scrimmage, make it easier for J.J. McCarthy on play action, 2nd and 5. Maybe they're going to run, fake the handoff. Maybe one of the great receivers pops wide open, whether it's Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, or their tight end, TJ Hawkinson. But for now, it seems like they're trying to figure out a way to keep Jones. The deeper question is, will they find a guy who will be more of an effective between the tackles bulldozer that can really help diversify the Vikings offense? Because when the playoffs roll around again, if the Vikings make it, when they make it, one of these years they will in the coming years. They're on an every other year plan. They've been on an every other year plan, it seems like, for a long time. They need to start assuming we're going to play in January. What do we need in January? You need a running game to complement whatever you develop in the passing game. Next up, as I refresh my memory on what the topics are, Myles Garrett. On Friday, we presented during PFT Live the Run PFT segment with Michael Hawley. The question of whether or not the Browns, if they choose to relent to the Myles Garrett trade demand, should say to his new team, if you want Garrett, you have to take Deshaun Watson. Now, I know there's a fine line between outside the box and just effing nutty, but that's the kind of thinking that teams need to have. You need to be creative. Whether or not it works is one thing. Whether or not you're thinking of creative solutions to your problems is another. Remember, it was the Browns who were part of the deal that saw them take on Brock Osweiler's albatross contract in 2017 and get a second-round pick from the Texans. I remember when that deal was reported. I remember when it first landed. It's like, why would the Browns give up a second-round pick for Brock Osweiler? Oh, wait, they're getting a second-round pick for Brock Osweiler? What the hell is this? Well, it's a way of thinking that has become more prevalent in the NFL. Sometimes, to offload an unfortunate contract, you have to do something unconventional. And if the Browns are willing to admit they made a mistake with Deshaun Watson, which I think is the biggest impediment to all of this, the owner of the team, Jimmy Haslam, doesn't seem to be willing to acknowledge that they screwed up when they traded for and signed Deshaun Watson in 2022. He's got 2 years left on the deal, $46 million a year, fully guaranteed every penny from signing, $92 million left. First, they have to be willing to acknowledge they made a mistake. Then they have to be willing to let the world realize they're acknowledging their mistake. I'm not sure they're there. I'm not sure they'll ever be there. They might just keep their heads down, their mouths shut, and the money flowing to Deshaun Watson until he gets every penny of the $230 million contract because they never want to admit they were wrong. That's possible. But if they are willing to admit they were wrong, this is a way to solve two problems. You've got Myles Garrett with 2 years left on his contract in Cleveland. You've got Deshaun Watson with 2 years left on his contract in Cleveland. Garrett wants to be traded to a contender, and I know the Browns don't want to do it. Well, you're never going to get your best possible trade compensation if you say, okay, I guess we're going to trade him. You got to be coy. You got to play it out. But if there's a way to foist Watson onto the Garrett deal, it makes sense. And I know that the armchair salary cap experts on social media just want to dismiss the entire possibility because the cap charges would be crippling. We posted an item on Friday explaining that there are ways to do it. There are ways to get around it. As simple as trading Garrett sooner than later and delaying the Deshaun Watson portion of the trade until after June 1, when the cap charge for the Browns would be split into 2 years. So it's not impossible, might be implausible, but it's the only way out. Well, it's one of the only ways out if the Browns really want to get out from the last 2 years of the deal. And if another team wants Myles Garrett badly enough, they'll pay the $92 million, the Deshaun Watson tax, to get Myles Garrett. And also to make this work, number one, the Browns are going to have to take less by way of draft picks because they're getting rid of this $92 million contract, the remaining portion of the $230 million deal. And also Garrett might have to be willing to expect less when it's time to get his new contract. Hey, you want to go to a contender? You go to a contender. You don't also say, I want a top of the market deal, $35 million a year, $40 million a year, whatever it may be. I just want to go to a contender. I'll take less money than what I might otherwise want if that's the only way I get my wish and I get to go to a contender. So I don't rule out anything at this point. Teams can be creative, but they also can be stubborn. And step number one for this Watson-Garrett possibility is the Browns acknowledging to themselves and then to everybody else that the Deshaun Watson contract and trade was a disaster. As I've said many times, at a minimum, it's the worst trade and sign deal of the salary cap era that goes back to 1993-94. It's arguably the single worst transaction in the entire history of the NFL when you consider everything that was invested in Watson. Because the money makes us forget they gave up 3 first-round picks and more to get Deshaun Watson. Those players would have come in at, if you scout them well, a high level of skill, contributing to the team for multiple years at a low rate of pay compared to veterans, and definitely compared to a veteran quarterback who has done nothing to earn the $230 million that he'll make when the contract ends. And what would the new team do with Deshaun Watson? You don't make him your quarterback. You cut him. You just cut him. Or you keep him on the roster for 2025 while he recovers from the retorn Achilles tendon, and you see what he has in 2026. Maybe the fresh start helps him. The naysayers also said, oh, he's got a no-trade clause. Well, yeah, he's got a no-trade clause, but why would he say no to a trade at this point? Surely he'd like to get out of Cleveland. Surely he'd like to get a fresh start. He's human. He knows what's been going on. Maybe a fresh start is exactly what he needs. Instead of waiting 2 more years for it and becoming a free agent, he could go to a team and see how it feels there. Maybe he competes in 2026, or maybe they just cut him. Maybe they cut him on the way in the door. Just take on the $92 million, get Myles Garrett, and move on. We'll see how it goes. Pointed out last night, the Commanders are the betting favorites at DraftKings to land Myles Garrett at 3-1. The Commanders have the cap space and the cash to pull this off if Deshaun Watson is part of the deal. I have no idea whether or not it's even going to be contemplated. It's just the kind of solution to 2 problems for the Browns. And the Browns have shown us over the years, frankly, even with the chief strategy officer and the things they've done to get to the playoffs, they had a good run in 23. It feels like they're perpetually laying the foundation for something. They still have shown when it's time to make the big decisions, they haven't done a very good job of it. They had Baker Mayfield under contract for another year. They started flirting with Deshaun Watson. It pissed off Mayfield. They had to trade him. They had to go all in for Watson. You don't want to make mistakes like that, especially at your most important position on the entire team. All right. Lastly for today, and this was a surprise to say the least, to dredge up a scandal that took the NFL by storm, but it happened in 2013, and it was a big deal. I remember going to the Today Show studio on a Sunday morning and talking to Lester Holt, now the host of NBC Nightly News, about the Richie Incognito-Jonathan Martin scandal. It was huge. It was a big deal. And it's almost bizarre that it's back. It came back because Jonathan Martin and his parents spoke on the record at length to ESPN.com. The story arrived last Wednesday, and I remember pulling up ESPN.com and seeing the picture of Jonathan Martin today, and my first thought was, who's that? And I looked more closely. Oh, Jonathan Martin. Who's that? And then I sat and thought about it a little bit, and my impaired brain reminded me, Jonathan Martin, Richie Incognito. Kind of a big deal in 2013. Kind of odd that that's the big long read on ESPN.com in the days after the Super Bowl. And I texted with the other PFT writers, what do we do about this? Is there anything here? The problem with long reads, there are many problems with long reads. They just don't fit with today's consumption of news in the sports world by the average consumer. Because what you end up with, and I know the people who write the long reads don't like it when I say this. I'm sorry, but it's true. You have to sift through paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of fluff and facts that the average sports fan doesn't care about, right? It might win you an award at the rubber chicken dinner at the end of the year. It might get you the acclaim of colleagues who haven't read it either, but they're just glad that the art form still exists. It really is a bizarre aspect of sports writing generally. But what you got to do is you got to parse through it and parse through it and parse through it in search of the needle in the haystack of word salad. And we decided collectively as of last Wednesday, there's enough other stuff going on. This isn't something we're interested in, so why would our audience be interested in it? And that's been my guiding principle since the day we flipped the switch, November 1, 2001. 23 years and 3.5 months ago. Had to stop and do the math. My guiding principle is if it's interesting to me, there's a chance it's going to be interesting to you. Now, this thing became interesting for me personally when I saw that I had a new direct message on Twitter yesterday afternoon, and it was from Richie Incognito, sharing a link to a column from our friend Omar Kelly, the Miami Herald, which had a pretty strongly worded headline. Because the one nugget, the one needle in that haystack of the ESPN article was Martin saying, I never believed I was bullied by Richie Incognito. And Incognito has taken that and extrapolated it into justification that he never did anything wrong. Everything was fine. It was all made up. It was all fake. It was all false. Now, I might be overstating his reaction, but that's how it comes off. He sees this as his vindication for everything he went through in 2013. It's far more complicated than that, and it's definitely not conducive to a debate in the cesspool known as Twitter, because 280 characters cannot do justice to the subtleties of this case. The basic reality is this was like a perfect storm for the NFL, because I believe that the things that Incognito and others were allegedly / actually, more on that in a second, because we don't know the whole truth on this, but based upon the Ted Wells report that was generated in the aftermath of the events that caused this whole thing to explode, the Ted Wells report made some specific findings about the things that his team concluded Incognito and others had done. It happened between two people who I think, given their personalities and given their circumstances, helped the planets align. You have a guy in Jonathan Martin who, and part of the talk when this all first came up, and I don't know whether it was people defending Incognito or it was just reality of the NFL locker room. Sometimes guys come up and there's a perceived need to toughen them up. Even without that, there is coarse language in a locker room. Guys say things to each other that you wouldn't say to someone that you meet on the street. It's a different kind of communication. It's raunchy, it's raw, it's bawdy, it's inappropriate. And the reality for the NFL is that it's the way it was everywhere in 2013. It was a cultural issue. And what the NFL did with the Dolphins and Incognito is no different than what the NFL did with the Saints and the bounty scandal a year earlier. That's how far back we're going. We're going to 2013. It was 2012 that the Saints bounty scandal happened. And as former Commissioner Paul Tagliabue found, when Roger Goodell stepped aside from the judge, jury, and executioner role as it relates to the players who were punished for the bounty scandal, when Tagliabue was the one who got the assignment, he explained to the chagrin of Roger Goodell that when you have a cultural issue like this, and Tagliabue compared it to the steroid scandal of the 80s, when Pete Rozelle, then the commissioner of the NFL, realized there was a steroids problem throughout the league, the solution wasn't catch one team red-handed, hammer them harder than you've ever hammered anyone, and hope everyone else straightens up and flies right. What Rozelle did was acknowledge to the league at large, we've got a cultural problem here that needs to be solved. Here's what we're doing. The rules are changing, and moving forward, if you break the rules, there will be hell to pay. What happened with the Saints was the NFL realized it had a cultural problem. It hammered the Saints, and to the extent that the rabbit hole went deeper, and it did, the NFL plugged it with cement and moved on. See, the NFL didn't want, especially at the time, think about what was happening in 2012. The concussion lawsuits had just been filed. The NFL was just 3 years into its epiphany forced upon it by Congress regarding head injuries. the game day protocol, the return to play protocol, things that didn't exist before 2009. The NFL had to develop like that, or it was going to have a problem with Congress. It did have a problem with Congress. The NFL solved it on its own. So that was the background. So here comes this instance of evidence suggesting that players were being compensated for applying ostensibly clean legal hits that rendered the opponent incapable of continuing. Now, some of the hits were questionable, but the idea was you knock the guy out of the game, you get a little stack of money. The higher the stakes, the bigger the game, the more money was at play. But this was a cultural thing. And instead of solving the cultural problem, the NFL caught the Saints, hammered the Saints, and hoped everybody else would stop. That same mindset applied in 2013, I believe. Instead of dealing with the broader cultural issue, giving Incognito a pass, giving the Dolphins a pass, telling everyone, look, society has progressed. It's no longer 1960. We can't behave like this. We can't treat other people like this. Even if they say 13 years later they never felt like they were bullied. You can't do these things. You can't leave a guy the kind of voice message. And read the ESPN article and look for the voice message. We have the quote of it in the PFT story as well. The voice message that Incognito left Martin in April of 2013, you can't talk to people that way. We can't do that. But the NFL, instead of addressing the deeper cultural issue that I believe extended throughout the NFL as it relates to the way some players talk to other players and other people who entered their field of vision, whether they were employed by the team or not, that's the way it was, and that needed to stop. But in lieu of making a cultural change, the NFL felt like it had to, given the fact that this Martin case came to the forefront. You've got the player who had parents who were very involved and very upset and very motivated. Bad problem for the NFL. You have a villain in this story who had a history of off-the-field misconduct. One case in particular, you can look it up on Google. It involves a charity golf tournament and a female volunteer at the golf tournament who allegedly was mistreated by Richie Incognito. You've got a guy who fits the villain role. You've got a guy who fits the victim role. And in comes Ted Wells, and off it goes. And the next thing you know, it's a big mess, and Incognito and others suffer the consequences. Now, with all that said, and this is even more fascinating because Incognito will accept nothing other than every media outlet that covered the story and shared the facts and the statements from the NFL and the findings of the investigation. He wants a full apology from everyone who simply was doing their job. Well, part of our job included the next Ted Wells investigation and the Deflategate investigation from 2015. That, because the Patriots very aggressively pushed back. The Dolphins didn't push back on the Martin Incognito situation. The Patriots aggressively pushed back. And we had reason, based upon the reporting and the inconsistencies and the holes in the facts and the appearance, that they just wanted to nail the Patriots, that some owners thought the Patriots didn't get hit hard enough for Spygate in 2007, so they wanted to get him again, that this was something where the end result was determined in advance and the investigation worked backward. And when the Ted Wells report eventually came out, there's enough there to allow the reasonable mind to conclude this is a situation where he knew what the client wanted and he worked backward to justify the conclusion. Instead of starting at the beginning, making no assumptions, having no preordained outcome, and going where the facts would lead you. And I believe the facts of that case should have led to a finding that it's inconclusive, that they might have had some program in place to take some of the air out of footballs, given, those text messages between the deflator, the two guys who I don't even know where they are now. Maybe there'll be a long read about them after the next Super Bowl. But the evidence that day, AFC Championship, Colts, Patriots, January 2015, the evidence is inconclusive. So I think Ted Wells did what he believed his client wanted him to do. And that's one of the common flaws of outside law firms being hired by what one of my old law firms called cost-insensitive clients. They'll pay the bill, no matter how big. They won't quibble. They won't go line by line and say, this phone call, 45 minutes? What did you talk about? That didn't take 45 minutes. This brief, wait, 10 hours for a 5-page brief? It shouldn't take you 10 hours. We'll pay you 5 hours. Some clients will do that. They'll devote time and effort to picking through your bill line by line and negotiating the bill down. Happens all the time. Law firms, the successful ones, the big ones, they want clients that just pay the check, cost of doing business. We don't have the time to pick over this. We're just going to pay you because this is a problem that we need to have solved, and we're not going to nickel and dime you. We want to get the best possible service. Or more accurately, we want someone who's going to give us the outcome we want. When I practiced law, from time to time, I would get the sense when I was brought in to do an investigation, outside, independent. And it's never independent because the lawyer's getting paid by the party that wants the investigation done. So the nuance, the dance, you get the idea. If you're smart, if you're aware, you get the idea what the client's looking for. And if you give the client what the client's looking for, you're more likely to get the next one where the cost-insensitive client who's going to pay your bill without quibbling is going to hire you to do the case, and your law firm is going to make a shitload of money. Sorry, London, even though we're not on in London today. And what's intriguing about this, how did Ted Wells get the Deflategate assignment? If Ted Wells hadn't given the NFL what it wanted in the Incognito case, Ted Wells probably isn't getting the Deflategate assignment. He's already given us what we wanted once, and now we believe he'll give it to us again. These are just my opinions, Ted Wells. Please don't sue me. These are opinions based upon the reasonable conclusions that could be drawn from the facts and circumstances of the situations. Ted Wells, one could argue, gave the NFL what it wanted in the Incognito case, which gave him the opportunity to give the NFL what it wanted in the Deflategate case. But the Deflategate case ended up being a big enough of a mess. I might have to do some research here. I don't remember Ted Wells showing up again. I remember at some point, Mary Jo White became the default option for the NFL. And if the NFL wasn't getting what it wanted from Mary Jo White, she wouldn't keep getting hired to do these independent investigations, which are not, by any stretch of the imagination, independent. Because the person doing the investigation always has a vested interest in doing more. Because they don't do it for free. They get a lot of money for it. Which brings me back to an item that I found this morning, because when I woke up, it's like, wait a minute. This Ted Wells thing, I feel like there was something. At some point, we said something about Wells and Incognito once the Deflategate dust settled. And we had an item, August 9, 2015. Incognito, speaking to, I think it was Bob Glauber of Newsday. And it was a very reasonable commentary from Richie Incognito. And he had a point. And we said in the article he's got a point. He was complaining about Roger Goodell's power. And one of the things that Incognito complained about is because the league never actually disciplined him, the Dolphins did, there was never a forum. There was never an opportunity. There was never a chance to test the evidence. There was never an appeal of a league-imposed suspension because there was no league-imposed suspension. The Dolphins suspended him. The point I made, August 9, 2015, maybe given what we know about Deflategate, we need to revisit Incognito and Martin. Maybe Incognito's got a point. Maybe some of this stuff was trumped up a little bit. Now, the voice message, which was recorded and kept and played by Martin's father to Anthony Olivieri of ESPN.com, that's undeniable. But maybe there was a shading of the facts. Maybe there was an engineering of the investigation to get to the end result that Ted Wells thought the NFL wanted. And what never was brought up by Wells is what Roselle Tagliabue brought up in his ruling in the Deflategate, in the bounty. I'm getting all my scandals mixed up. Let me try that again. What was never brought up by Wells was the observation made by Tagliabue in the bounty gate case, that when you have a cultural problem that stretches across the entire league, you don't solve it by making a scapegoat out of one team and one person. You take a broader look at anywhere and everywhere this might be happening. You communicate to the teams that the rules are changing, that the expectations are being revised, and that the bar is being raised regarding the way that people deal with each other at work. And then moving forward, if there are violations, there will be significant punishment. That's not what the NFL wanted. And the Bountygate experience tells us that's not how the NFL under Roger Goodell operates. When the NFL recognizes a cultural problem, the last one to do it, the one that brought the cultural problem to the attention of the people who should be aware of the cultural reality of the NFL at any given moment, the thing that put it on their radar screen is the thing that becomes the centerpiece for aggressive discipline, and then you hope everyone else gets the message. So, this is not a simple issue. And the fact that Martin said he never thought he was bullied doesn't change the behavior, especially as it relates to behavior that was directed, according to Ted Wells, to others. It's not an exoneration, but it is, I think, a moment to ask whether or not the Incognito case was handled like the Bounty case, was handled like Deflategate. And in both of those cases, I was one of the only ones saying, this smells bad. And it's unfortunate in hindsight that no one pushed on it. And the problem is Incognito isn't exactly a sympathetic figure, but no one pushed, none of his representatives, none of his lawyers could say the right thing to the right time to the right people to get someone to say, hang on, I smell something here, and it ain't roses. So we'll see where this goes from here. It landed on one of the slowest Sundays of the early offseason. Scouting combines next week. We were a week removed from the Super Bowl, and boom, here this thing comes. The article was hiding in plain sight for 3 days, and no one seemed to notice it. But boom, there it was yesterday. We'll see where it goes moving forward. And I know that there are some incognito bros out there saying he should sue everyone. Let me just finish by pointing out a couple of things. First of all, the statute of limitation has likely expired on any lawsuit he could bring against anyone. And to the extent that you think he should sue all of us in the media, we were just reporting on the statements, the findings, the allegations, et cetera. And we're entitled to add our opinions to these statements, the findings, the allegations, et cetera, that others have reached. The Ted Wells report, the content of the Ted Wells report allows fair commentary on the things that Ted Wells concluded Incognito did. But the statute of limitation is gone. The other side of this is very simple. And this is what I would do if I was practicing law and I had a potential client who wanted to sue someone for defamation. The measure of damages in a defamation case is the impact to the person's pre-existing reputation. And we can do a deep dive on the history of Richie Incognito. All I need to do is point to the 2012, and I believe 2012 is the year this happened. The allegation of the inappropriate behavior directed to the female volunteer at the charity golf tournament. Richie Incognito is not going to be your ideal plaintiff in a defamation case, because in order to determine what his pre-existing reputation was before someone lied about it, even if there were lies, this assumes there were lies told. If there were lies told by Ted Wells, by the league, what's the pre-existing reputation? Because we can't determine the damage to the pre-existing reputation without knowing it. Let's just say it would have been a challenge. Let's just say I would have been disinclined to accept the representation of Richie Incognito in a defamation case. So, look, I understand he believes he was mistreated. I understand he's going to direct that at anyone aggressively. I mean, there's a certain irony to the fact that a guy who was accused of bullying is now bullying those in the media who won't say he wasn't a bully. I understand it's difficult for him. I don't want to fight him physically, verbally, in any way. I understand that he's been through some things. I don't want to make him the villain again. It's possible he is the victim. It's possible that Ted Wells' investigation operated inside out with the end in mind, and then the facts shaded and twisted and directed toward the conclusion. It's unfortunate that he didn't have someone, an agent, a lawyer, someone who could properly crack through the crap and get someone in the media. The same way that I came to the conclusion that Bountygate was some BS, Deflategate was some BS. That never really happened. I don't know that it'll happen now. It's 12 years plus later. And I've talked about it for longer than I ever thought I would again. I literally had forgotten more about that scandal than most people today would ever know. I don't want to go back and relearn it. I don't want to go find the entire Ted Wells report and read it again. I read the summary last night on NFL.com and used portions of it in the story we posted. But that's where we are. This is a complicated, difficult, and challenging situation. And yes, it's entirely possible that the NFL, in solving, or at least attempting to solve a cultural problem, found one person and one team to turn into the scapegoat and then moved on. Just like in Bountygate, I believe. Just like in Deflategate, I believe. So that's it for today's edition of PFT PM. If you listened this far, thank you very much. You win the grand prize of a 1-year subscription to PFT. And every time I say that, someone will inevitably ask me, how do I cash in my subscription? Folks, it's a joke. The content's free. Everybody gets a free 1-year subscription to PFT. We've been free since day one. And we'll be free until the day I drop dead, which is when you'll be free of me. But not until then. I'll see you tomorrow, unless I drop dead tonight. Have a great day. Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.